This presentation concerns the upcoming resolution before the City of Boulder Planning Board that asks the neighborhood groups that been dealing with the Hogan-Pancost development to be, quote, more open with their information. I asked staff to clarify what information that they're referring to that we have not been open about. And it boils down to two things. First is a review that we commissioned of the groundwater report. We have not submitted that review yet to the city. And secondly is information regarding the flood study that I presented at the January concept plan meeting. So let's talk about that flood study presentation a little bit more. If you recall, back in January, I presented information that showed that the flood study was fatally flawed, that it was based on the wrong number, that they made a pretty gross mistake. Well, let's look at that in a little more detail, and please bear with me. This is a bit of a long story. Back in May of 2007, more than 5 years ago, the developer and city staff had a meeting. The city provided peak flood flow numbers from the ongoing South Boulder Creek flood study. They showed a total of 23 cubic feet per second of flood waters were flowing across that property, including 16 cubic feet per second along the ditch. This is a ridiculously low number. A mistake was made. 3 years go by. The developer wrote and submitted a 700-page report that's based on that 23 cubic feet per second number. That report was reviewed by city staff, by external engineering firms, and by the planning board. It was presented at the January 2011 planning board meeting. No problems were noted in the flood study. However, following that meeting, the developer had to revisit the flood study because the city asked them to include a 50-foot wide easement along the west side of the property to hold any future potential South Boulder Creek mitigation engineering work. The developer looked at the flood study and realized that there was an error with the flood numbers. They notified city staff. Staff contracted with CH2M Hill to pull the new flood numbers from the current South Boulder Creek study. And they realized that indeed those numbers were wrong. The table shows the data pulled from the flood study of the peak flood flows across various transects on the property. And it shows that yes, it's actually 177 cubic feet per second, 8 times greater flow than the flood study was based on. Now, most if not all reasonable people would assume that the next step here in the process would have been to have fixed the flood study, presented that to planning board again, and notified citizens that yes, a mistake had been made, but it's been fixed. However, that's not what happened. 8 months go by. Roll forward to last fall, late fall of 2011. A neighbor of mine, Jeff Rifkin, and we start looking at this information. And we're really confused. We're looking at this flood study. It's a 700-page study with huge amounts of data. Jeff sent this following email to city planning staff. This planning staff that we know now, after the fact, knew that the flood study was an error. Specifically, Jeff cited the flood study and asked them that he'd like to see where the data came from that they were using in that study. Here's the only staff response we heard. They said, and I quote, "attaches the flood flow information that the city provided for the Hogan-Pancost site." They sent the new flood numbers. They sent simply an image of that last table I just showed, with no further explanation. So now Jeff and I are really confused. We have the 700-page study. We have all these new numbers. Nothing seems to jibe. So we set up a meeting. Jeff Rifkin and I and another neighbor, Ron Craig, met with 3 planning staffers in December, last fall. specifically to talk about the flood issues and the groundwater issues. We talked about a number of technical details in the flood study, in particular that the vertical datum used seemed to be off. None of the staff mentioned the error. Rather, they told us the opposite. They told us that these studies were written by professional engineers, reviewed by professional engineers and planning board, and nothing was found wrong. Wow. So needless to say, Jeff and I are really confused now. As I say here, confusion reigns supreme in December between Jeff and I. We're meeting at VIX. We're going over these numbers. Nothing is making sense. Finally, in late December, right before Christmas, we had an aha moment. Finally realized what happened. It wasn't our misinterpretation of the numbers. We realized that the numbers were indeed wrong, and we discovered how that error happened back in May of 2007. A few weeks later then, we had the concept plan review. This is what the developer submitted to the city regarding that flood study. And they said, and I quote, "This concept plan conforms to the findings and recommendations presented in the 2010 study." Nowhere did they actually, in anything that they submitted, state that the flood study was wrong. Likewise, staff said the same thing. Here's the staff memo to the planning board for that meeting. They said that actually that the study showed that the development might even make flooding better. Furthermore, the staff presentation, likewise, they said that the results of that study were that the stormwater management facilities could be designed to accommodate the proposed development. Mind you, at this time, the developer and staff knew that the flood study had been there. They've known it for 10 or 11 months. If you recall, I presented information that about this flood study error. Planning board members expressed a desire that they would have liked to have been informed about that information before the presentation. If you recall, though, at the end of that meeting, the developer's project manager stood up and said, "Oh, yeah, we knew about that error." I just like, wow. In the following weeks, Jeff Rifkin and I had a meeting with city flood staff to talk about some other flood issues. We brought up this flood study error, and one of the flood staffers said, "Oh yeah, one of the planning staffers came down in March of 2011 with that study, and that's how we all found out about this." Needless to say, I was rather upset. I called one of the senior staffers that I've dealt with for many years, and I asked him, I said, "But why didn't you just tell us? Why didn't you just tell us that the study was an error and fix it?" The staffer responded, "Oh, well, there was no protocol for that." Since when is a protocol required to tell the truth? Since when is a protocol required to not deceive citizens, not deceive boards and councils? I used to, for years and years, I've dealt with this development. I used to tell neighbors that we have to trust staff. We have to trust the process. We have to trust the boards and the council. This is all we have. We don't have a choice. Well, my apologies to anyone that I ever told that we need to trust these people. They have violated our trust in the process. We urge the board to actually vote no on this resolution, not because you want to see a closed process, but rather that the resolution doesn't go far enough and actually talk about being honest and open, all members, all parties, to this process. Thank you.